Welcome to the Character Course, episode 4. This week we're talking about forgiveness. Now, last week we were talking about love and how all our efforts to love other people can be energized by the love of God. But there's a problem with love. And the problem is this, is that sometimes our attempts to love other people are motivated really by our desire to be loved ourselves. So instead of loving because we are loved, we're loving in order to be loved. And this leads to a fragility in our attempts to love other people. The moment we experience a cold, a rejecting, an unloving response, we may conclude that love isn't the best attitude. The moment we decide that we're getting a bit of a raw deal, we maybe decide to cash out and do something different. But what good is our love if it bails out at the first sign of an unloving response? That's what we're going to look at today. When we start to think of situations where we're loving against all the odds, where we're loving beyond ourselves, we're beginning to stray into the realm of forgiveness. One psychologist defined forgiveness as giving as we gave before the hurt occurred. And today we're going to look at the strange backwards logic of forgiveness, that when we reach ourselves out in love towards those who may not love us, some part of ourselves gets healed in the process. There's so much to say about forgiveness, given that forgiveness is so central to Christian theology and so important in the teaching of Jesus. But what surprises most Christians is knowing that there's actually a huge raft of scientific studies done on forgiveness. There's been an explosion in the last few years. 30 or 40 years ago, if you went looking for scientific studies on forgiveness, you'd find just a handful. But now there are literally hundreds of studies outlining the psychological, physical, and spiritual benefits of forgiving. If we are forgiving, we're more likely to experience improved relationships, less likely to be anxious and depressed, more able to escape from addictive behaviors, and more likely to experience spiritual transformation. But forgiveness isn't simple. Psychologists have talked about forgiveness in all kinds of different ways because in order to understand it, we have to get clear about a few things. Firstly, forgiveness doesn't always lead to reconciliation. We can forgive somebody, we can begin to see them as a human being again, we can get rid of our embitterment and our hatred towards them, but we still may not trust them. Sometimes reconciliation isn't possible. Sometimes reconciliation isn't safe or desirable, even if forgiveness leans us and inclines us towards wanting to repair a relationship. And the other thing is that forgiveness doesn't condone pain and injustice caused by other people. Forgiveness only becomes relevant when those things are around. So rather than making those things okay, forgiveness says, these things hurt, they're painful, and how will I now respond positively? Forgiveness, therefore, is not about making violence or abuse or unfairness okay. Quite the contrary. Forgiveness only really applies when we've been hurt. In the short term, responding to injustice with anger is perfectly reasonable. What anger or aggression says is it says something here has happened that is wrong, it's unacceptable, and I want to act immediately to rectify it and to show people that it's unfair. The problem arises when our short-term response becomes our long-term attitude. We carry anger and aggression away from the situation to a place where it's no longer useful for us. And if we're not careful over time, we end up living with a bitterness and a hostility that can never be resolved because the situation to which it actually applied ended a long time ago. Very often, the transformational opportunity for forgiveness arrives at the point when we realize that our hostility is doing us more harm than good. It's just not working. And we're faced with a choice. Do we hold on to our grievance, or do we free ourselves and let it go? But it's a genuine and painful dilemma, particularly if someone has done something horrible to us or those we love. Theologians have critiqued the psychological understanding of forgiveness. They've said it's a bit individualistic or egocentric, that it mistakes forgiveness just for the good that it does for the person doing the forgiving. In a sense, they're saying that forgiveness is much more than that. It's a much bigger context. It can't just be viewed as an emotional coping strategy. And to be fair, many of the psychologists studying forgiveness agree with them. In the New Testament, forgiveness is the most radical, transformational, revolutionary concept. In first century Palestine, Jesus was born into a nation that was looking for forgiveness. They viewed themselves as the chosen people of God, and yet for generations they'd been living under oppression. They'd been owned, they'd been managed, they'd been enslaved at times by empires that were greater than themselves. And not just the Romans, before that the Greeks, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. And so they were left with this terrible dilemma. They were the chosen people of God, and yet they'd lived their entire lives in bondage. But this left them with a significant identity crisis, a real head-scratcher of a problem to solve. How could they be God's chosen people? How could they be God's favourites and yet be oppressed by every empire that rocked up at their borders? How could that be the case? The only way they could square that circle was to say, okay, if we're being treated like this, then we must have disappointed God. God must be unhappy with us. If we're his chosen people and yet we're being treated as if we have no significance whatsoever, we must be under God's punishment. And by the same token, therefore, they were thinking, therefore, if we can somehow induce God to forgive us, to be okay with us again, then that will be the moment in which we're finally restored. That will be the moment in which our status, our rightful status as an earthly superpower, is finally given to us. For them, forgiveness meant not just being free from guilt, it meant a restoration of their significance as a nation. And that's what they hoped the Messiah would do. That was the expectation that swirled around Jesus, that he would finally restore their political superiority to them, that they would know that God had forgiven them when God proved he was on their side by taking out their enemies. But the kind of forgiveness that Jesus talked about completely shattered that view of things. He said it was difficult to live under the forgiveness of God if we weren't prepared to forgive other people. As we saw last week, he said that we should love our enemies, love those, pray for them, bless those who intentionally harm us. And even he himself, as he was tortured to death, overtly forgave those who caused his pain. Jesus totally reframes this idea of forgiveness. The problem is not oppression by a superior power. The problem is the way in which we allow that oppression to justify our own aggravation and hatred. The problem isn't just them, it's us too. And we are the only side of the problem that we really have responsibility for. It's a crazy idea. In a world of oppressive regimes, incompetent and arrogant leaders strutting about on the world stage, the ever-churning flow of online outrage, that forgiveness is the answer? Really? Really? People get killed for ideas like that. Forgiveness, therefore, is not an act of weakness for people who are too scared to fight for their rights. It's an act of courage for people who are prepared to forge an alternative pathway to pain and hurt and injustice. But it takes time. Even if we've decided we want to forgive, some psychologists have estimated it takes a minimum of 5 hours of reflection, of prayer, of action to reach a point where our decisional forgiveness becomes emotional forgiveness, for our initial commitment to forgive to reach to our core. Perhaps the most well-known psychological model of forgiveness was devised by Everett Worthington, undoubtedly one of the leading researchers and pioneers in this field. He points to 5 processes that make up the movement of forgiveness, which spell the word reach, R-E-A-C-H. Firstly, R. We recall the hurt. To begin to forgive, we have to be aware of the sadness, the shame, the stress, the anger that we've experienced, perhaps as a result of what someone else did. We don't deny it, we don't minimize it, we feel the hurt, we acknowledge it. That's the starting point. Second, E. We empathize with the offender. Easier said than done. We don't make their actions right, but we do at least begin to think about what made them do what they did. What were they trying to do, even if their behavior was hurtful or painful or unfair? Thirdly, A. We offer the altruistic gift of forgiveness. Humility and gratitude are key to this third phase in forgiving. Humility to remember those times when we messed up and needed to be forgiven, and gratitude in remembering how good it felt to be forgiven ourselves. If we become mindful of how wonderful it is to be forgiven, we may be inclined then to offer forgiveness as a gift to someone else. Fourthly, C. We publicly commit to forgive. It's actually quite tough to forgive, and therefore we need help from other people. Plus, on top of that, if we make our commitment to forgive public, we're more likely to see it through, and less likely to give up on it when the going gets tough. Fifthly, H. We hold on to forgiveness. With the best will in the world, it can be really difficult to sustain our forgiveness over time. And that's why the fifth and final movement in the reach model of forgiveness suggests that we maintain our sense of commitment, our desire to hold on to forgiveness over time. And this is where the real character building takes place. It's not just about forgiving one thing, it's about becoming a forgiving person. And so those are the 5 steps, the 5 movements, if you like, in the reach model of forgiveness. When it comes to forgiveness, it's not enough just to know the steps, we have to dance them. And that's why you'll see in the additional notes there's various different resources you can follow. You can even go to Everett Worthington's website and download his workbook of forgiveness for free. And you'll read there about, for him, forgiveness isn't just a theory. He was forced to live out all the things he'd researched when his mother was brutally murdered by a home invader. Forgiveness isn't just a theory, it isn't just a concept. It has to be worked out. It takes time, it takes effort, and it's not always easy. In New Testament Greek, there are 2 principal words used for forgiveness. The first is aphiamai. It means to let go, to release, to set free. The second is charizomai, which means to freely give or to grant a favour. And that's what forgiveness is all about. When we are forgiven, we feel freed, we feel liberated. When we forgive, we offer that freedom to someone else.